So the first thing I'm going to do is welcome everybody to our final Engaging All Ages in STEAM session as part of the Bendigo Invention and Innovation Festival, which is the launch of the Jaunt Girls in STEAM Electric Car project. Now, this is a really exciting and aspirational project that we'd like to establish in Bendigo. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what we're planning to do after we've heard from our guests today, Martine Berger and Dave Budge of Jaunt. But to give you a little bit of background about why I'm so keen to bring an electric car project to Bendigo, it starts about 15 years ago when I used to work with a school team developing electric hybrid vehicles for an event called the RACV Energy Breakthrough that many local people will be familiar with, which at that time was sponsored by the RACV. And that involved building these fantastic hybrid vehicle cars that the students would do endurance racing, as well as a whole lot of entrepreneurship work around presentation and development. And I was helping students make single passenger hybrid vehicles that had 2.4 kilowatt motors and could do 90 kilometres an hour on just 48 watts. So it wasn't a big stretch in my imagination to actually want to build an electric car. And there were people have been doing this in Melbourne for decades. And what you have to remember is this is before Tesla had even produced their first motor vehicle. This is when Who Killed the Electric Car was the really big conspiracy movie talking about these sorts of issues, and where a lot of the arguments were a lot of nonsense about how electric cars were more polluting than internal combustion engines. So I got as far as buying a Volkswagen Beetle with the intention to convert it to electric. And then I left that school and I parked that idea, and it wasn't until I was at a Bendigo manufacturing group meeting with some of the local partners that I said, oh, look, I've had this idea for a while. I really want to build an electric car. At which point Trevor Budge, who's been working in ECDEV on the City of Greater Bendigo Council, said, oh, you need to meet my son because he's doing this amazing startup. And I said, that sounds pretty cool. And so I went off and I met Dave. And I heard about what Dave and Martine were doing and have been in love with the idea ever since, and have been quietly marshalling resources in the background, ready to launch the project. And so I'm going to hand over to Dave and to Martine in just a second. Dave's the CEO of Jaunt Motors, and Martine is a co-founder. And their strapline is electric vehicles for adventure, which I think is wonderful. And look forward to hearing all about it, having the factory tour. I'll be back a little bit later to talk about our project in the context of Bendigo. But for now, I'm excited to share with you all the story of Jaunt and to hear what these guys have got to say. So handing over. Thanks very much, both.
So Dave, do you want to give us a quick overview on Jaunt?
Sure. Thanks, Graham. And I guess, yeah, that sums us up pretty well. We hope, we're glad we're getting the message out there. As you can see, I'm standing in front of part of a car, or most of a car underneath. And what we do is we take these old four-wheel drives, these old Land Rovers, and we convert them to electric. And that's really as simple as that from what we do here in the factory. But the goal of doing that, and the reason behind doing that, is to be able to get electric vehicles out there into the world, into Australia, electric vehicles that are really built to go down those dirt roads and drive through the bush and get you to that surf break or whatever, or through a winery or whatever it might be. Something that's really fun and really appropriate and very, very different to, like Graham mentioned, Tesla, very, very different to a sort of high-end luxury sedan that is this sort of brand new performance car. These are vehicles that have a sense of nostalgia and have a sense of place and belonging in Australian history, world history, but also just incredibly fun. And the important thing that they also do is recycle. So we can take cars that have been around for 50 years and hopefully give them another 50 years of life. And so there's a huge amount of different trades and different technology that goes into these. And that's where it's really exciting that the crossover can be, while there's some high-end advanced manufacturing and there's some very traditional automotive and craftsmanship, it's a complex puzzle, but one that can be tackled from a lot of different areas, including bringing it into an educational environment and doing some work that is applicable across not just electric vehicles, but drones and all these electric powered mobility devices that are coming down the path and are going to be the future of cities. So it's a fantastic educational tool in the process of being a really, really fun four-wheel drive.
Why don't we tell everybody a little bit about our backgrounds, Dave? So you kick off and then I'll follow on.
Okay. Well, should I talk about you, Martine, and you talk about me?
Okay, fine.
So this is more challenging. So Martine grew up in Mount Isa in Queensland, and so that's as you can imagine. I mean, as a lot of us here from Victoria, that sounds like a really exotic place. I've never been there, but it's in the middle of nowhere, Queensland, and so I imagine everybody's driving four-wheel drive utes there, and so that from that sort of beginning. Ended up, through various communications and technology and projects and careers and jobs, ended up working together with me. And about 13 years ago now, in a web project. And that idea of that working on emerging technology, I guess, is something that's always brought us together in communications and design and tech. And maybe naively, but ambitiously, we felt that the idea of bringing the emerging technology of electric vehicles and electric vehicle conversions was something that wasn't necessarily too far outside the realm of what we've done, because it's really about finding great people, talented designers and engineers, and bringing them together under a sort of single vision and bringing the project to life.
Okay, let me tell everybody a little bit about you then. So Dave grew up in Bendigo, which is apt, I think, as his dad was living there. I met Graham on the train, I think. So Dave spent a lot of his youth doing things with his hands and working in technology, really, but more electronics and kind of, computery stuff. And we met each other in the advertising realm. So Dave quickly went into directing films and television series, and he being a director and me being a producer, we worked on some pretty exciting projects. And yes, with new and emerging technology towards the end there. And after 13 years of working with each other, or 11 at that stage, we had a pretty good rapport with one another. Our careers diverged a little bit, but they came back together again. And that's when, as Dave said, we started to have discussions about opportunities. My discussion with him was originally, hey, Dave, let's start a business, start a new film production business in new and emerging technologies. And his was, hey, let's get together and start a business where we convert old Land Rovers to electric vehicles. And he won. So here we are. I think you've kind of gone over what we're doing with Bendigo at the moment, or did you want to touch on a little bit more about exactly what it is we're going to be doing with Bendigo Tech School?
Yeah, so I guess it's, and Graham's touched on it briefly, and we'll come back to some of the details of the program, but what we always set out to do was be able to, we sort of saw the landscape of Australian automotive manufacturing, saw the decline of that, but that doesn't mean that we were lacking in skills and experience around the country. And particularly when you're dealing with a car that's 50 years old, it's the skills and experience to work on that are all across the country. And so we felt that there was an opportunity to do something where create a product where we could sort of distribute the manufacturing to a certain extent. And that was what was great, is those sort of early ideas and that thinking around how we build and how we approach that manufacturing process, this combination of old school trades and new school advanced manufacturing was really where it kind of aligned perfectly with what the tech school was doing, this design focused manufacturing. And the other great thing was that by distributing the elements, and this car, as you can see, I'm sort of standing in front of a third of a car, they come apart nice and easily. And it means that what we can do when working with the tech school is they can have, traditional automotive aspects done with other places, while focusing on the educational program being around the electric vehicle side of thing and the design thinking and the user experience, which is really where we wanted to bring it as well.
Well, we actually have quite a good structure for this talk and what we want to take you through today. It's got two parts. The first part is we want to dig a little bit deeper on exactly it is why we started Jaunt and why we chose Land Rovers as the basic for our electric vehicles. And then after that, well, we've got Dave in the factory there standing in front of a car, so we'll get him to take us through in detail how we build the car. So a little bit more about the why is, well, there's 4 key reasons why we decided to start Jaunt, and that is because, and why we chose Land Rovers. It's because we think that the vehicle belongs, that we can build cars that are more approachable and accessible, and that we think our idea, our business idea, holds a lot of value on many levels, and that we think these cars are incredibly desirable. So when we talk a lot about the vehicles belonging, that's because we think that Land Rovers are kind of a part of Australia's landscape. And the reasons for that is that there are thousands of these cars in farms and in sheds around Australian properties all over the place. And they don't rust because the body panels are made of aluminium. So they're ripe for the picking and ripe for restoring, I suppose. And over 30 years, the actual basis of the vehicle, the model, the chassis and the parts, they didn't really change. So all those parts are still available from the UK. And it really does make it the perfect old vintage car for us to be working on. And we see these cars as kind of iconic, and I've just put an image up there on our slideshow of, a classic Land Rover shot where, the car is bogged. And I think if you've lived in Australia for a long time, somewhere in your family heritage, I'm pretty sure you'll find a Land Rover has been there. And I guess, and Dave always talks a little bit about Land Rovers belonging to certain place. And what do you mean by that, Dave?
I guess that, one of the things that we always felt was that where do you use a car, right? And obviously there's cars that are perfect for commuting, getting around the city, long distance travel, and those niches are really filled by mass manufacturers. So we're not trying to, with a 50-year-old car, we're not trying to compete with, the Toyotas of the world. But what we are trying to do is create a car that is more of a special occasion or a travel experience in a different way. And so the idea that you could have a car that felt more appropriate to place. So the way we might describe it is that, you go out to the countryside, you go somewhere overseas, in Australia, wherever it might be, and you're there for the local food and the local wine and the culture and all these other elements that kind of, you want to feel like a local and experience all these things. One of the elements that can let that down is the fact that maybe the only transport option is a rental car, and that's a brand new Corolla with a Hertz sticker on the back. And no offense to either of those things, but you immediately feel out of place in that. But if you could get into a vehicle that, for example, like the vehicle that's going to be converted with the tech school, that was from that area. So maybe it was a Land Rover that used to live on a farm just over the hill. If you could take that vehicle, repurpose it, rebuild it, electrify it, power it by, potentially even a community renewable energy project, that's suddenly a vehicle that you can drive around in that really does feel like it belongs. And that's a sense that, it also is appropriate to take a great Instagram photo or whatever as well. But that's because it is cool and it does feel a part of the larger experience of travel and exploration.
And another reason we chose this vehicle is I've just popped another slide on the screen there. And these are the results. These are the top 10 vehicles that were sold in 2019. And of the top 10, 8 of them were either four-wheel drives or SUVs, just showing that, four-wheel drives and SUVs, they're familiar to most people in Australia, and they truly do fit the vision of tourists and locals' vision of Australia.
That's a statistic that is unique really anywhere in the world. So this isn't just you can often think of Americans driving large pickup trucks, and they do, but very, very quickly in their car sales, it turns into it's sedans and hatchbacks, whereas Australia has this unique relationship with sort of adventure vehicles, and the idea that you can have a vehicle that one day will cross the Simpson Desert. Whether you do that or not, that's the nature of vehicle sales. And what we felt was that what we saw in the data was that the electric vehicles available had no real correspondence to the types of cars that Australians wanted to buy. So we're still waiting for manufacturers to deliver electric four-wheel drives of any sort.
So another reason we think that, you know, we're on a good wicket here is that EVs actually do belong in Australia. And the next slide that I've just shown you, they're showing you charge points all across Australia. And there's a pretty big misnomer that there aren't many charge points throughout regional Australia. But there are. Like, you can see that there are thousands. And that is a top-down view from very far away. If you zoom in on PlugShare, an app specifically for you to go and search and find a charge point, you know, they are all over the place. So, you know, regional Australia is absolutely ready for sustainable tourism. Moving on from that, another key driver that I mentioned was that we wanted to create vehicles that were approachable and accessible. Now, Dave is standing beside one of our latest and greatest. Yes, she's not ready yet, but what he can show you now are some of the design elements that we've worked on to make these vehicles, or all our vehicles, far more accessible to drivers when they first get inside, unlike other EVs potentially.
I'll just flip the camera around. So I might actually jump around to the passenger side because it can be a bit easier to see. The really interesting thing, you know, that we wanted to sort of combat and get over was that if we're taking a vehicle that its shape can be quite nostalgic and can be quite exciting, but the reality of driving an old four-wheel drive is pretty terrible and pretty mechanically complex, and you forget that, oh yeah, you've got to use a choke, and you've got to wonder what that light means, and this pressure's right, and all these kinds of things, and you're operating this loud old piece of sort of clockwork. And so that complexity was there. And the other idea around that was that major manufacturers are building cars that are designed to bring value to ownership, and they do that by adding a lot of features, and that's usually with software features. And if you've bought a new car in the last few years, you can know that if you change brands, it can be kind of like changing brands of phones, like shifting from Apple to Android kind of thing. So that it's all sort of the same, but it's all sort of not, and it's a bit of a learning curve. And when we're thinking of having vehicles for people to rent in you know, the countryside, you don't want to be sitting there trying to figure out how to use a car, and that can be the experience often when you rent a car these days. Is you pick it up at the airport and you spend the first 5 minutes figuring out where all the controls are. So how do we take two complex things like an old mechanical car and a new EV and bring those things together to make something that's actually simpler and easier, so that you can just enjoy the experience? So I'm pointing at the dashboard here, and this is something that we've spent a lot of time on to figure out how to, of course, keep that sense of history and nostalgia and nod to the original aesthetic, but also bring in, you know, all the controls that we need to operate a modern EV. So broadly speaking, this dash kind of didn't exist in any kind of form. And we've tried really hard to make it feel like a 60s, 70s looking thing. But these are cars that never had heaters, never had stereos, were very, very basic at first. So some of the things that you expect in a modern car just weren't there. And even the language and iconography was all quite different. So part of that is keeping it simple. And you can see we've designed custom gauges and not tried to overload you with, you know, technical electronic speak around amp hours and kilowatt hours and all these kinds of things, because it shouldn't matter. You should just know that this is a fun and simple car to drive. So yeah, there's a gauge for battery level, but it's just full to empty, which is all you really, really need to know. So obviously speedometer and some switches for headlights and wipers and that kind of thing. But even things like having a indicator switch, that is not quite attached yet. But things like that, it was there, but it was very, very difficult to use. The horn was in a strange place. So changing a lot of those things, but then also adding what we feel is like quite a sympathetic approach to integrating EV controls. So one of the great things around EVs is that I guess if you think of it like a power drill, you can spin it forward or you can spin it backwards. So there's no finding reverse and leaning right over. You can just press reverse. So simple things like having a push button auto system for the car, having some extra features around regenerative braking and how that affects and improves four-wheel driving, and little things like this is a stereo head unit. This is actually from a boat. These are marine stereos, and there's a lot of other components that we've sourced from from all different kinds of manufacturing to bring into something that this is a car that will have a canvas roof, so it's exposed to the elements. We need to be considering those things. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is be able to say to people, hey, just get in, turn the key, press D, and drive away. And that's as simple as it needs to be.
And I mean, all that ladders up to, you know, these vehicles being better vehicles than the original, you know, vehicles that Land Rover built, which is pretty awesome. I mean, they hold value on so many different levels, which is another reason why we thought these cars would be awesome to work with. I'll just show you a second slide here. We did a little bit of research when we started thinking about how best we could add value to something like the rental industry in Australia. And what we learned from that research is that clear and upfront pricing is a number one bugbear for everybody that goes to rent a vehicle. And next to that was that there was a distinct lack of choice for EV vehicles. So we need to make sure that we add value from an experience perspective. And that's our aim. We're going to tick every box that makes people a little bit more comfortable with renting a vehicle. For instance, do they really need to rent it for 24 hours? Could they not just rent it for 4 hours or 8 hours to just tour around, the local Bendigo area? And, what is that price? Does it include insurance? Yes. Well, all of our prices will be a flat rate. So they're the kind of things that we're looking at there. Another reason we think our ideas is incredibly valuable is that right now that there's this intense global demand for tourism products that are more adventurous, more sustainable, and more attuned to the cultural experience of that area and inspire a path of self-discovery. Well, that's exactly what we're building with the Jaunt. Our rental vehicles provide an awesome experience just to drive, just to get in and drive. It's awesome. I know I've done it. It blows my mind. Plus we're hoping that each of our vehicles that we rent will come with a map that has a curated journey for that local area, so that you then get to experience all those little hidden gems that the locals only know about. Another reason why it's valuable is that, our EVs obviously won't add to transport emissions in Australia. And of course, our cars, as Dave mentioned at the very start, our cars are recycled. So we're not adding to those hundreds of thousands of tonnes of vehicle waste each year. Another point that is adding value is that at the moment in Australia, there's a real lack, as we all know, of that last mile transport. So when you fly into a place like Byron Bay or you take a train to Katoomba, it's highly likely you won't then be able to easily travel around and look at that local area or just outside the city that you can walk to. And that's where we see Jaunt, filling that gap as well, especially if we're able to offer the 4-hour rental opportunity or 8-hour. So Dave, I just wanted to show people the map that we developed of where trains can take you.
So this was just an interesting thought around, as Martin mentioned, that last mile of transport or last few miles we might talk about, because there's a lot of focus on major metropolitan areas on how you cover that last mile, and whether that be Lime scooters or Ubers or electric bikes or whatever it might be. And those things are great, but they fall down pretty fast. No sort of pun intended, I guess. They fall down where you're having to do something where it's a more of a regional area, and maybe the road you need to travel on is an 80 kilometre an hour speed limit. It doesn't necessarily feel safe. It isn't necessarily practical to be covering those distances on individual small transport. So, as we've mentioned, like I grew up in Bendigo, right? And so I know that, it's easy to get to Bendigo by train, but then what do you do? There's a bus network, but it's built for local transport rather than any kind of tourism infrastructure. And so people, say, coming to the art gallery can get to the art gallery and you could walk up View Street and get there. But then how do you get further afield? And so you're actually in a bit of a transport desert, as it were, to get from sort of that central core around that train station or that major transport hub, and to get any further. So one of the just sort of interesting studies that we did when we were thinking about how could an electric vehicle that you could pick up, say, at a train station, how could that expand on and facilitate broader movement and people to be able to get around? So this what you can see on this screen now, which doesn't look like much, it just looks like some roads. Those pink lines are the rail networks. And what Martine just turned on then and what it switched to, that green area is a 100-kilometre radius around every passenger train station in Victoria. Now, we're not going to have a Jaunt at every passenger train station in Victoria, but it's a really interesting thing to think that if you had an electric vehicle with even a 250-kilometre range, suddenly most of Victoria is accessible to you from within a short trip. And while we're not necessarily there yet and transport use is changing, but the private ownership of vehicles is still going to be a thing in Australia for a long time to come. The needs of tourism and other forms of transport are changing and growing. And obviously, if you're flying into a place, flying into Bendigo Airport now, what do you do? If you're coming by train to a lot of these places, what do you do? And so the idea of I guess, car share and short form car rental is something that I think really has an appropriate place in rural and regional Australia, as well as Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane.
Mm. So I've talked through, we've talked through the fact that we're creating something that has value, it's approachable and accessible. But the other reason we'd like to do it is because these vehicles are eminently desirable. They're extremely attractive and they capture so much attention on the road. It's quite fantastic when you drive one. You feel very special, and it's that kind of car we think people would really love to drive, especially while they're kind of touring around, various parts of Australia. So I'll just show you this picture that you're looking at now. Just kind of demonstrates how customizable they are. So our vision is to have a fleet of these vehicles for rent, but we're also building them at the moment for private customers, because as a startup, we need to kind of get the ball rolling before we can start building our own vehicles. So at the moment, we've got customers making weird and wonderful choices about how they'd like to customize their vehicle, from really fancy teak decking, for instance, through to cushioned leather seats that fold down in place where the radiator used to be, those kind of amazing things. So entirely customizable. They're fit for purpose. So we're building one that the vehicle that Dave's in front of right now is being built specifically for a winery called Mountain Ridge, which is really close to Jervis Bay, which has those beautiful blue, crystal blue waters. So we've chosen this colour. It's going to be the perfect car for touring the area, but also for weddings, also for test drives for people who are interested in buying a car in the future. So each car can be built bespoke for the place that it's going to be situated in, or your house, your farm, your beach house. So we also use premium materials like marine grade fabrics, and you saw some of the componentry in the interior there. They're marine grade stereo systems, so that you can have a soft top and go through a rainstorm and potentially not damage anything. What were you going to say, Dave? I saw you.
I was going to say something and now I've completely forgotten.
Okay,
I don't know. I think the thing around the idea that these are, I guess, aluminium sheds in a way on wheels. They're very, very simple, very, very boxy, but that does lend itself to customization. A really interesting thing to think about, and how we've gone from cars like this that have a lot of personality and character to cars that are very much appliances, and that's okay because they serve their purpose. But although we've all been traveling a bit less the last few months, it's always an interesting question to think, can you even name the last 5 Ubers or taxis that you got picked up in? And often you can't, because they're the same sort of generic modern car. Now that makes a lot of sense when you're buying something that's just around, being the most practical, safe vehicle to commute in. Now, we are kind of the opposite to that now, because we're never claiming that we are necessarily the most practical or the most safe. These are still old cars, but they do, we think, have the most personality, and there's a place for that as well as there is for reliable transport or standardized transport, I guess.
Absolutely. A lot of the people that are intrigued or inspired by our cars, they're looking for, a little bit of nostalgia. Maybe they had one as a child, and they're looking for that unique and kind of nostalgic experience when they're coming to look at our cars. And we make sure that each car has kind of the personal details and personal touches that do speak to it being quite unique. We put little plaques on there letting you know who helped build your car. There's just a level
I can show that really quickly.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. So that's the thing, is, and again, thinking of these cars as we don't, it's not about, we didn't want to build cars for people who are obsessed with cars. We want to build cars that are just nice objects and that a wider audience can appreciate. And part of that is not necessarily having to worry about whether it's a Land Rover or a Land Cruiser or a Jeep. It's just about knowing that this car used to live over there and did this thing and was built by these people. So treating cars as more individuals, I guess, than a mass market commodity. And so, for example, here's a plaque that lives on the transmission tunnel, and it's just who it's built for. And this is Mountain Ridge Wines, who's the winery where it's going to. It's also instructional. But we also have things like a friend of ours up in Yarrawonga did the work on the transmission, and so his name and signature is on that panel. Other people who did work on the chassis here, their name and signature and critical information is on here. So treating each part of the car as its own piece of craft and its own art form, which it really is, because there's a lot of different trades involved, as I mentioned. So continuing that on and thinking that we can build a car along with Bendigo Tech School, and while some of the tech and the components will be designed and manufactured by Jaunt, a lot of the elements will be crafted by the Girls in STEAM program, and that will continue to be celebrated. And you can look 20 years from now and be able to see your name, poke your head under the car and see your name written on it.
I mean, it's almost like we're building new stories for these cars. I mean, if it can travel with its old story and potentially travel with its new story in the form of plaques and identifying who helped build it, I think that's a really special thing. And as you said earlier, these are absolutely, and as you can see, these are the opposite of EV mass manufactured cars. And that's a great point of difference for us. So underpinning all of this, the gorgeous exterior and the stories that we can tell, is the fact that we're building some pretty complex vehicle upgrades and improvements in there. So Dave is situated in the factory in the perfect position now to talk us through the build process, which I think is pretty interesting. So why don't you go for it, Dave? I'm going to kick off with a picture.
Sure.
Exactly what Mountain Ridge looked like before.
Yeah, I think that picture's a good example, and I'll switch the camera around to give a actually it still looks like it's missing a few parts, but that was the car that we started with, and that car was, as you can see, it was a color called Land Rover called it Bahama Gold once upon a time, and it was pretty rusty, pretty oily and pretty messy, and it lived on a farm or sat in a field for the last 5 years, and then sat in another field for another 10 years before that. There was pine needles through the gearbox. Spiders everywhere. It really didn't work very well. So, but as we've mentioned a couple of times, the great amazing thing about old Land Rovers is that they're predominantly aluminium in the body. So the aluminium has sat there and hasn't rusted. The chassis sure is steel and there's elements, but the dry climate of Australia plus the aluminium body means that there's this stockpile of cars. And Australia, during the 60s and 70s, was buying about half the Land Rovers that were being made, because every farm had one, and they've continued to sit there. And so then we can go and rescue them and turn them into something brand new. So this is awaiting a bunch of parts to be fitted. So this is basically the view you saw before, but with a whole bunch of new componentry. What you're looking at now, and again, this is there's a lot of wires going all over the place, but there's no engine, of course. There's only an electric motor. And if you can see under here, that is the size of it. This circular element here, the cylindrical element, that is the electric motor that we're powering through a series of basically 3 battery packs that all can work independently. And this box up here is, I guess, where all of the cabling comes together, and a lot of the safety systems are, and the fuses. And so there's a lot of commonality with even elevator mechanics, because elevators are electric motors that are moving a passenger vehicle around. So things like fusing and contactors and relays, and a lot of these systems are for the 1%, the one time where something goes wrong, where there's some small malfunction somewhere, something's detected, and we need to initiate some safety system. Electric vehicles are, of course, incredibly reliable because there's only really one moving part. There's a magnet spinning a motor here. So all of these systems are designed to make you unaware of what's going on, and the complex monitoring that's happening. And you can see all these cables. Every battery cell that we have in the vehicle is independently monitored and controlled so that we can always know what's happening. Temperatures are measured. But what it means, but more practically and broadly, there's a big battery in the front here that imitates the weight of the original engine. So all this space, this empty space that you can see here, that will be a battery pack in there. Then we also have battery packs in the sides. So a big part of it, and another reason these cars are fantastic, is because there's lots of squares and right angles, and batteries are squares and right angles too. So being able to have a battery pack that can fit within the chassis, within the ladder chassis of the car, means that we can keep the weight really low. We can, reduce the center of gravity and improve the handling of the car, while also actually making it safer as well. So you can see on each side there's a battery pack. There's also battery packs here that live under the floor, under the tub of the rear. And depending on the options that we're building the car for, you can see all this additional space that we can also fill with batteries to create even sort of longer ranges. And that's a benefit of a small scale bespoke manufacturing, is that we don't just have to have one battery option. We can have 1, 2, 3, 4 different range options, depending on how you want to build the vehicle.
Awesome, Dave. Did you want to keep talking to us about it?
Sure. What would you like me to talk about?
No, if you finish taking us through it, then this is the perfect
I
point.
mean, I can talk forever about every single part here. I mean, there's I can, Martin. There's there's elements too where we're thinking about this. Is not a singular vehicle. We're thinking about this as a model range, and one of the great things again about old Land Rovers was that from 1958 to about 2016, these cars were basically the same, and a lot of that was down to lack of funds at Land Rover. It doesn't really matter why, but it just means that we've got this platform that we can optimize components for and deliver standardized parts across a very, very broad range of vehicles. So when we can think like that, we can think holistically about what we'd call the remanufacturing process. So we take the car and don't just kind of touch it up, completely torn down, every nut and bolt removed, the chassis removed, going through a galvanizing process to make it permanently rust-free. And then as we're replacing fasteners, there's crazy things like these cars were built in an era where there was a transition to metric, but you were dealing with old imperial sizes and even earlier British standard sizes and Whitworth, all these different specifications of just the nuts and bolts. So it allows us to go through and standardize on metric nuts and bolts, for example, which seems a little thing, but it means we can start to write our own standards and our own documentation, and then do things like have a 12-volt system. So electric vehicles still have a 12-volt battery to run the lights and the stereo and all that kind of thing, but be able to use like high-quality components for those. And while these are still waiting to be wrapped, it means we can do things like remove the need for the old-fashioned fuses that we use and have a computer system that runs the car and can talk to all the systems, which is, again, something for the driver to not notice, but to rely on when something goes wrong, potentially, and a little light can come on and tell you what's going on, or it can send a signal back to us and tell us what's going on, that kind of thing. And even be able to integrate systems and just do little things like fade the cabin lights as you leave the car, and things that you come to expect from a modern car, but were impossible to do with old analog circuitry.
Awesome. Well, maybe now is when we can throw to Graham and just ask anybody if they have any questions about the build or why it is we're doing what we're doing.
Thanks very much for that really fantastic overview of what you're doing with the project. And every time I talk to you both about it, it excites me greatly. And I've had the good fortune to pop down to your current factory premises in that brief period between the two lockdowns when you could travel and do things like that. And that was a really great day. Now, there's the way people can ask questions is to pop themselves a chat in the chat window. The button that operates chat is in the middle and at the bottom of your viewing screen. And there is a moderation process, but one of the co-panelists will pop those up as they come through. So if you've got any questions, do that. Now, while we're waiting for the questions to flow in, I guess what I'd like to talk about is why this project and why now? Why create a recycled electric car as a community enterprise project for Bendigo? And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that we are a high-tech innovation hub, and our commitment is to work with industry in the region to give young people the skills that they need for jobs of the future, in particular enterprise skills, tech skills, and also to, in the case of this particular project, to encourage girls into STEM careers. So I noticed there was a comment from one of the panelists asking where girls fit in. So we specifically want to work with girls to encourage greater uptake in those engineering and advanced manufacturing industries, because currently women participate in those roles at only 50% of boys and men in those industries. So we really want to create a space where women can work on this project, and that will involve not only students from our partner schools. We work with 14 schools in Bendigo, but it's also going to involve working with mentors from education and training and from industry, and also hopefully working with students in tertiary as well. So really we're at the point in time we've got enough resources where we can start the project. We're now having a conversation with community about, right, what are the next steps and how do we encourage involvement? And we've already had fantastic discussions with TAFE around supporting the project through Kangan, and for both students and staff to be involved. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I guess the other reason why we're doing this project is we have a number of different focuses on industries that are projected to grow. And 3 of those are transport, tourism, and also new energies. So that's part of the tech school remit, is to work with industry in that space. So this is a perfect project that enables us to leverage those 3 areas. And I guess even more importantly than that, we want to have a conversation with our community about the future of transportation and the importance of sustainable approaches to the future. And it's just really interesting to reflect on all that's happened in the past decade or so. The number 1 car manufacturer by value is Tesla. That happened only about a month ago. Even though they only have about 10% the output of a company like Toyota in terms of vehicles produced, they're now the world's most valuable car company. And I think that says something about the value that people are attaching to technologies in terms of investments and having a future focus. If you rewind the clock to 1900, electric vehicles outsold internal combustion engine vehicles by a factor of 2. Now, it wasn't until the development of the Model T Ford in 1908 that all of a sudden there was a very inexpensive, very easy to own motor vehicle, and it effectively killed the electric car market. Even though it was an inferior experience, it was very loud and vibrating because it was so cheap. It became accessible. The electric cars had the benefit of operating silently. And of course, they back then they were slow and they had range issues, but all cars were slow and had range issues. I mean, once upon a time, you used to have to buy your petroleum at a pharmacy in a 1-pint bottle in the UK in the early days of motoring. So essentially, it was innovation that killed the electric car the first time around. But now that technology is caught up, you see circumstances like Norway and the Netherlands where electric cars outsell all internal combustion vehicles. And I think, it's time we started thinking about what electric cars mean for our future. So Martin mentioned last mile transport and train stations. Well, we have a train station, and we know that there isn't an easily accessible location where you can get a rental vehicle in the centre of town. So that interests us in terms of how we can connect in with people coming in from out of Bendigo, but also how they can also use a vehicle to access places that a regular rental car won't go. We think that's important. The community enterprise model helps us reinvest in the project, and we love that as well. And just to talk about some of the resources that we have lined up, I'm really excited to let you all know that probably the most essential element of the project that we need, a car, We've had one donated to us, and I'm just giving a quick shout out to Chris and Julie Mason, who I know are listening in at the moment. They're fantastic industry partners of the tech school through their Mind Shop business, and we love working with them. And they knew somebody, a relative, who had a collection problem of old Land Rovers and Range Rovers, and they brokered a wonderful meeting. And I went down, and I'm not going to name the individual just because I know he values his privacy a little bit. We had a great chat. And this wonderful person who's just so passionate about technology and about what we're doing agreed that he was going to donate us not a Land Rover, but a Range Rover, an older one. And one of the great things about working with the Range Rover, it's a design evolution of the Land Rover, and it's going to be a lot easier to work on for us and a lot easier for us to restore. And it'll be a more comfortable driving experience for what we want to turn into a community enterprise. And I was really persuaded with that engineering discussion around why those vehicles are good. And look, Dave and Martine think it's great as well. It was actually a classic Range Rover conversion that inspired Jaunt in the first place, done in the UK. And we're really excited to go down that path. Now, the other thing that we need, of course, to make this project happen is a location proximal to the train station. And we have a partner in the Discovery Science and Technology Centre who are going to work with us not only in providing us space at the back of Discovery Science and Technology Centre to work on the vehicle, but also allow us to locate the vehicle there. And there's another project that they have going to enable us to install a charge station. But I think they need to raise some more money. So one of the things we'll do with this project is help them to raise the money they need to have the vehicle charger there. So we'll have this iconic, upcycled, recycled electric vehicle in the centre of town, available for the community to use. Some of the things and resources that we need to make that happen, the restoration of the vehicle itself. Kangan TAFE has stepped in and offered to do the restoration through their apprentice program at the Automotive Centre of Excellence down in Melbourne, in the Docklands. So we're really excited to be able to announce that. Also, Mark Brennan, who is the design lead of the Hawkeye vehicle at Tallis, happened to be part of that conversation I had with Trevor Budge those 2 years ago. And he has offered assistance from Tallis with electrical engineering optimization of the systems to help us really get that right. And the last thing that we need to start building the project and make all of this happen, the students and the mentors to the local industry, and that's the invitation we're extending out to the Bendigo community. We'd love, we'd love people to be involved with this project, young women in our partner schools and in post-secondary education and from industry in Bendigo. So that's what it looks like at the moment, and I'm enormously excited to start working towards the next steps, which have been somewhat impacted by the current circumstances. We might not get started until next year instead of Q4 like we'd originally planned, but at least we can start talking to and working with the schools about getting together all of our people to work on the project. So I guess there's a few comments coming in through. So I think I've explained where girls fit in. So there's a question here, and I think this is more for Jaunt because we're only proposing to make one. How do you plan to scale up remanufacturing capacity to fulfill increasing customer demand?
That is a great question because we are actually, in our current capacity, and we're just moving. We would be moving if it really wasn't for lockdown. Moving to a new factory. This is our sort of startup space, and we're moving to a dedicated space. But even at our projected capacity for next year, we're sort of booked out till 2022, which is a great thing for us. But it really asks the question, how do we more quickly facilitate that distribution of manufacturing? Now, we're already, as I mentioned, gearboxes rebuilt by a friend in Yarrawonga, for example. Now that's just one small piece, but there's a number of different manufacturers around the country who we're working with to deliver small pieces of this, and particularly excited about a relationship we've started with an Australian battery manufacturer, and looking to do as much as we can with Australian manufacturers as possible as we, I guess, get things right. So there's a lot of stuff in the car that is simple. For example, we've just been spending today putting on little crimp terminals. Now, that as a task is really, really easy. But the reason behind that task is the complex thing to figure out. So as we do that and develop the documentation, develop, I guess, a conversion kit, which is really what we need internally to streamline things. But that also means the documentation, the parts, those challenging items, and the quality assurance is done. And that's at a point where we can then start to think about, if there is a men's shed that wants to take on a project, and obviously the restoration of a car, and then bring in a vehicle conversion kit, a sort of authorized and optimized and quality assured by us, to then be an introduction into working with EVs. So we're getting there, but it requires a little bit of us from going, I guess, from a startups phase that we're in now into a scale-up phase and getting that optimization in manufacturing.
There's a question there that follows on actually beautifully from what you're saying, Dave, and it's asking, will it be desirable or necessary to do short runs of custom production replacement parts? And I think that feeds into what you're saying about the conversion kit, doesn't it? That yes, we will be doing that, and yes,
absolutely. And we get inquiries every day around some of the components we're making, and obviously some of these things that we do, specific to electric vehicle. Everyone might want a nicer dashboard on their old Land Rover, but it's, I guess, that idea of that combination between advanced modern manufacturing, which is small scale batch manufacturing, and by small scale I mean less than 10,000 units kind of thing. And this is one of the amazing things about the Tech School program, is that when you can have 3D printing and CNC milling and these precision high-end machines that it's economical to produce one of, or 5 of, or 10 of, that allows you to do major, world-class quality manufacturing, unique and bespoke manufacturing for a project like this. So the biggest challenge is just interfacing between a hand-built 1970s, built on a Friday, kind of maybe a bit sloppy in some areas car, and sub-millimeter precision modern manufacturing techniques, 3D printing, milling, whatever it might be, and interfacing those two things. And so that's where often a lot of the skill and a lot of the technique and craftsmanship comes in.
Yeah, Dave, and I'll just add to that, here at the Tech School, we very often get inquiries from people restoring cars who simply can't get parts. And we've assisted a couple of people to develop parts, and usually, elements of trim and things that we can 3D print. But we actually produced a part for a Range Rover that was very difficult to source. And we have a printer coming next year as part of our Department of Education annual equipment renewal funding. It's called a Stratasys J55, and that enables us to print ready-to-use parts in full colour with texture. So it means we would be able to, produce things to go straight onto vehicles, which is really exciting. Comment from Robbie here, one of our team, talking about how the Germany's domestic car market is growing, rapidly outstripping ICE, and Volkswagen are now in a position where they're outstripping Tesla sales because they've finally produced a mass-produced car that actually has curbside appeal. I think, competition is really here. And I just don't think there are the issues with range anxiety that we probably had a decade ago, because there's that wonderfully established network and people can just charge these cars up at home. And one of the points from Who Killed the Electric Car that just keeps coming back to me is, and I know, although that was a United States statistic, is that, most people in an urban environment don't really need to do any more than about 40 kilometres a day. And that suits about 97% of all motorists. So I think it's really, really viable. Now, a question from Chris Mason, who I mentioned. What will be the duration of the project? Will one team see it through, or will it be a multiple team project over a few years? And I think that one's probably for me to answer. And I guess, this is the first community enterprise project that Jaunt are doing, is largely their work has been around their own startup or commercial clients. And that's a hard question to answer. I wanted to see it as an 18-month to 2-year project so that we could start working with senior school students, and that might help direct them in terms of pathways from there. I guess a lot depends on just how long it takes. And obviously we're wanting to work with Jaunt and to to use their expertise as part of what we're proposing, and we've done a lot of planning and specification. And one of the things we're quite keen to talk about is actually using a Tesla motor, which completely does away with the need to have a transmission. So there's all sorts of things to consider. A lot will depend on how quickly we can marshal and work with our project partners, and also bearing in mind that COVID-19 has really impacted a lot of businesses really heavily. We don't want to put too much pressure on our partners whilst they're recovering. Although the good news in Bendigo is that there's been very little impact in terms of employment or economically on employers in the advanced manufacturing and engineering space. So Chris, I hope that answered your question. And a question from Rod Thompson: does the vehicle have to comply with all of the current Australian design rules and safety regulations, or those of the original time period? Dave?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that if you're familiar enough with restoration of vehicles to wonder about that, because it is something that that is unique sometimes to different countries, and different countries have different regulations around this stuff. Specifically with what we're doing, any EV conversion in Australia falls into the category of an engine swap. So if we were, lots of old Land Rovers, people went and put Holden motors in them instead of the Land Rover motor. This actually falls into the same category as that. So what that means is that this is still a 1978 Land Rover, as it falls under Australian law and compliance. Now, a 1960s, 70s design rules and safety standards were not fantastic. So we're not about just trying to just meet those. We are trying to exceed them and build the safest car possible. And I guess when we start with the idea that we're stripping everything out, rebuilding it, replacing the fasteners down to that level of detail and putting an electric motor in, it's not a pure restoration anymore. So where can we make and how can we make this car safer? So it's not a 5-star ANCAP 2020 vehicle, and it never can be. It can never have airbags installed. It's just not possible, like literally not possible from an engineering standpoint. But what we can do is create and I'll just switch the camera around again, is we can install a modern braking system. These cars had, you would have, if you've ever driven an old Land Rover, the brakes were terrible, the steering was terrible. All of these components can be changed without necessarily changing the overall experience of the car. So modern braking systems, vacuum, we have to create. If you're familiar with how brake systems work, we have to create vacuum because we don't have an engine to do that anymore. So we have a vacuum pump that creates that. We install, what you can't see behind here is a power steering system. There's a little dial here to adjust the intensity of the power steering as you'd like, but things like that make the car a lot safer and the handling a lot better. We also, by putting the batteries here and creating this structural element, we create side impact protection. We also do things, as I mentioned, that we have a central ECU that's understanding what's going on across the vehicle. So if we sense steering failure, brake failure, any loss of any systems, we can reduce the power of the electric motor, not kill it, not reduce the range, but reduce the ability of reduce the accelerator response, for example. So there's a lot of things that we do to try and make these a much safer car than they ever were. And it's not, I think Tesla make a fantastic product and everyone gets excited about the speed that they offer. We're not building race cars here. We're not building a Tesla competitor. It has, an amazing amount of torque from 0 RPM, but it doesn't have a high top speed. So it's designed to fall into the safety sort of elements and the performance elements that the original car did, but just do that a lot more simply, a lot easily, and obviously without all those carbon emissions.
And Dave, it's probably important to note that those side battery boxes aren't being held together with blue masking tape.
Oh no, that's a design change we just made today, Martin. No, those are to cover the holes at the moment where the bolts will go through. No, it's all very much over-engineered and things like, just for example, this is this cabling, this conduit that all the cabling runs through this is a rubber outer, steel inner core, then the cabling inside is shielded. So at every point we're considering that this is a four-wheel drive and it should still be able to function as a four-wheel drive. And if it should meet the utility of the original car, and in fact, it should actually exceed it in most ways. So everything is built around how safe can we make this, and how simple can we make this to operate, which also increases the safety.
Thanks very much, Dave. We're just coming up to the end of the session. I've just got one more question here from Andrew Queck at La Trobe University. As a community enterprise, have we thought about partnering with Men's Shed to provide mentorship element to young people as part of our operating model? That's a really great suggestion. And Andrew, if you have a way of connecting us in with Men's Sheds, we'd love to have a conversation about how to incorporate them. We're happy to work with anybody who can help us achieve the goal of producing an electric vehicle as a community enterprise project. And Ryan Peterson has added that it's fantastic work, loving the design renders. As far as this model is concerned, do you see opportunities for young and aspiring transport designers to join the team or to help create restorations like these?
Yeah, we'd love to. We get it's been amazing actually to see the number of inquiries that we've been getting, and I guess it's sometimes a little bit sad in a way, because obviously there's the amount of skill and talent in Australia around automotive is huge, but the industry has shrunk quite dramatically. So that support and that knowledge and particularly the education space around automotive design and engineering is huge, and we'd love to get big enough to be able to employ all the people who apply. So definitely down the track, we'd love to be able to support that.
That's great. And Ryan is from the Bendigo Youth Council. He's the chair of that organisation and doing some great work in this space. Well, look, we've come up to time, so I'd like to thank you, Martine, and you, Dave, for your time today. We originally planned for this to be a face-to-face event with Juniper, your first vehicle, up at Bendigo for people to pour over, and we were going to finish the day with with some drinks and nibbles and just let people completely geek out in this space. Unfortunately, this is the session that we had to have, but I think it was still great. It was it was good to draw on your knowledge and see that wonderful first-hand knowledge of a really exciting and innovative project, and we can't wait to bring it to Bendigo. So now I do have a survey, and I'm going to put that link up in the chat window. We'd love to hear your feedback on what you felt about the session. And of course, if you want to get in contact about being involved with the project, it's just a matter of going to the Bendigo Tech School website and hitting us up. Just put Bendigo Tech School into Google and then hitting us up through the contact options on there. And we'd love to chat to you. But Martine, Dave, thank you very much. And thank you for the work that you're doing in this space in innovation and thinking about our future, about new energies, and about this really aspirational product that is not only going to make such a difference in so many tourism contexts, but also enables people the option of customisation, which means that they value what you're doing a great deal more. And customisation is the next wave of industrialisation. So I think you guys are well ahead of the curve. I can't wait to work with you some more. But for now, may I thank you and I wish you all the best with your enterprise.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.